This week on Q&A, our guest is Melody Barnes. She's the Executive Vice President for Policy at the Center for American Progress.
Melody Barnes, Executive Vice President for Policy of the Center for American Progress. What do you do?
I supervise all of our policy teams at the center. We have the national security, domestic policy, and economic policy teams, as well as our fellows program. And that includes fellows who are at the center and in Washington, people who are in Los Angeles, all over the country. So it's my job to work with them and to coordinate their work and to try and drill down on the things that we consider to be most important and we want the world to know about.
What is the center?
The center is a research institute and think tank, and I think when people think tank, they usually think of something kind of quiet and sleepy. They think of a library. In fact, I was in a meeting once and someone said, oh, you know, one day I want to work at a think tank where I can just think big thoughts all day. And everyone looked at me and they started laughing because I almost fell out of my chair, because we aren't your grandmother's think tank. We do our work in a much more original and creative way. We're built on a model of 50% policy and 50% communications, which means that we have people who are thinking the big thoughts for the long term, also thinking about how we can make a difference in states and cities and in the country and around the globe right now. And then we marry that work with our communications professionals, our communications department, and we think about how do we get that out there to the American public? How do we get that out there to international leaders? Because if you're thinking a great thought and no one knows about it, you can't really change anything.
Why are you doing this?
Why am I personally doing this? Because I felt after my years on the Hill, I spent over 10 years working on Capitol Hill, I wanted to figure out what's the best way to use my policy experience and also challenge my interest around communications. How do you communicate with people about ideas? Take that out of just being a staffer, a role that I really enjoyed on Capitol Hill, but also one where I could speak for myself and also work with a group of people who are incredibly bright, incredibly energized, and quite frankly, it's all about changing the world, changing the country, helping the American public realize what it means to have a progressive America, to hear the other side of the debate that we think that they've been missing for a long time.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Richmond, Virginia, and I went home from the hospital to a house on Northumberland Avenue. A year later, my parents moved to Seminary Avenue, and they are still in that house. So I grew up in the same neighborhood and had some really, really wonderful times in Richmond. It was an incredibly warm and supportive environment. It was also an interesting place to grow up when you think about the late 60s and 70s and early 80s.
What are your parents like?
My parents are pretty incredible. I think that in some ways they are different from one another. In other ways, they share a lot of commonalities, which is why I think they've been married for 46 years. My mother was a teacher for many years. When I was little, she went back to school and got her master's degree and was in education, but on a supervisory level, and she loves children. I really think it's her passion. We often talk about what she would have done had she not grown up in the South during the time of segregation. Would she have chosen another career path? And I really believe that education still would have been her path, that it's her calling. And she still continues to do work in that area today. She's very warm. She never meets a stranger, ever, anywhere. My father grew up in Richmond, and he was in the Army, enlisted in the Army right after high school, and then left the Army and as an enlisted person, but stayed and worked as a civilian in the Army for all of his career. So although we lived in Richmond, I had the benefit of growing up with someone who understood the military and cares a lot about it. He's rather hawkish in his views. We have some great debates along those lines. But he's a very kind of, I call him as I see him, kind of person, great sense of humor, very mischievous.
So when do you think you developed your first strongly felt political position on anything?
I sold cupcakes for McGovern when I was 8. That's kind of my earliest memory of being politically active in some way. But I think my interest in politics really comes out of my love for history. Even when I was little, I was always reading biographies and reading about historical figures who were involved in government, involved in shaping the nation. When I was in college, my honors thesis was focused on the civil rights movement and political activity on college campuses in North Carolina during that time. But I think my experience with a 10th grade history teacher, Rodney Sudduth, had an incredible impact on my life. So my love for history and how this nation grew and became the democracy that it is today then ushered in my love for politics and policy, and some work I did in high school through presidential classroom and got to come to D.C. through that really led me to, I think, where I am today.
What did Presidential Classroom do for you, and what is it for those who've never heard of it?
Sure. It's a program for high school juniors and seniors, and they come to Washington from all over the country for a week. And we met with policymakers in all aspects of public policy in Washington, D.C., and learned more about how public policy was made, how the political system works. So I got to meet a really interesting group of people and some people that I stayed friends with for quite a while to get more of a flavor for Washington and the institutions, and just fell in love with it. My father said that he always thought he was going to have to pry me away from the Washington Monument to get me out of Washington.
8 years old, selling cupcakes for George McGovern, 1972?
Yes.
How did you get there, and where did you sell them?
It's funny, I have this picture in my mind, and I can't remember much around it, but I remember kind of being outside, and we had set up card tables, and there were parents and other students. I'm sure, particularly at that point, a lot of it came out of the activism from our community and our parents and having those kinds of conversations. We had, in my house, we had dinner together every night, and I remember my parents talking about the war and talking about President Nixon and talking about a whole range of political issues and listening to that and being involved in that. And I think it was a combination of those things, hearing it around the dinner table, the work and the activity going on at my school, that kind of thing.
Tell us more about your father being a hawk. Does that make him a Republican?
No. He's a Democrat, a very strong Democrat. But I think it's his belief in strong national security, his belief that in the importance of the military, and I think certainly from his experience being in the military, being stationed overseas for a period of time during the Korean War, and he just really believes in a very robust national security policy, which I think is consistent with the way the Center for American Progress sees it. I mean, we also believe in a robust national security policy. We believe that the military is very important, but we also have to marry that up with other tools, and that's something that Dad and I talk about quite a bit.
Center for American Progress started what year?
In 2003. In June of that year, 3 people in some space on 15th and H. I don't think there was much furniture. People had cell phones, and it was John Podesta and Sarah Wartell and a couple of other people. And we had our official launch in the fall of that year with the National Security Conference, and really has grown very quickly and very vibrantly since then.
When did you join it?
I started as a part-time senior fellow in the late summer of 2003, so I was there almost from the beginning. In fact, our numbers are on our paychecks, so you can kind of figure out where you are.
What's your number?
I think it's somewhere around in the 40s, and so we have grown very quickly since then. I then came on board as a full-time senior fellow about a year later, and then a little over a year after that, assumed the position that I have now.
All right, Cupcakes at 8. What's the next political thing you did?
Let's see, after Cupcakes at 8, probably running for being involved in student government in high school, in some way, the student assembly, running for and losing my freshman class president race. It's kind of one of those scars that you have to deal with, the rough and tumble of political life, but going on from there to be actively involved in student government, and then in college being very actively involved in a range of different campus activities.
Did you ever win an election?